Welcome all to the last moment of our very rich conference. I have the honor of presenting the last keynote speaker. Christopher Forth is the Dean's Professor of History at University of Kansas. He also holds a quarterly professorship in the Department of Women, Gender and Sexuality Studies and American Studies. His interdisciplinary and thematic research and teaching interests revolve around the cultural history of gender, sexuality, the body and the senses, with an emphasis on modern France, Britain and America, as well as European intellectual and cultural history. Having done his MA and PhD at the State University of New York at Buffalo, before taking up his current post, he taught for 10 years at the Australian National University and was an affiliate of the Centre for the History of European Discourses at the University of Queensland, a member of the Consuming Materialities, Bodies, Borders and Encounters Research Network. He's also editor-in-chief of our journal Cultural History, whose status in the academic world he has helped greatly to consolidate. As a cultural historian, he's especially interested in how gender, sexuality, the body and the senses are intertwined in a variety of social and cultural locations. In his books, he has examined how gender and the body framed the French reception of Nietzsche's philosophy around 1900. You see the first book on the left on the screen, Zarathustra in Paris. The social and political turmoil of the Dreyfus affair, the next book, and the tensions between masculinity and modernity in the West since the 1700s. In addition to engaging with social constructionist views of the body, he is increasingly interested in exploring materiality from a situative phenomenological perspective. His latest monograph, Fat, A Cultural History of the Stuff of Life, published by Reaction Books in 2019 and translated in other languages, which offers a reflection on how fat has been perceived and imagined in the West since antiquity, including discussion of status, gender, and race, and digging deep into the past for roots of our current notion and prejudices. Among his themes, fat emerged also as a substance associated with vitality and fertility, as well as perceptions of animality. He's currently working on two books project, tentatively entitled Life is Elsewhere, Feeling Alive in the Modern World, and Planet 5 Club, Masculinity, Modernity, and the Global Far Right, but he will say something about his current and ongoing work in a minute. As well as writing monographs, Chris has been busy over the years co-editing collective volumes. Body Parts, Critical Exploration in Corporeality, edited with sociologist Ivan Crozier, works on the belief that studying them reveals modern illusions about wholeness and how the body and its parts are implicated in individual and collective identity formation. Cultures of the Abdomen, Diet, Digestion and Fat in the Modern World, edited with Anna Carden-Cohen, explores this area of the body which we take for granted as an object of our gaze, the subject of our obsessions, and the location of deeply felt desires. Sexuality at the fin de siècle, The Making of a Central Problem, edited with Peter Cryle, examines how habits of thinking about the centrality of sex were articulated and what competing discourses had to be displaced in order for sexuality to become central. French Masculinities, History, Politics and Culture, co-edited with Bertrand Tate, offers a comprehensive and critical overview of ideas of how virilité has been imagined in France from the 18th century. Confronting Modernity in Fin de siècle France, Bodies, Mind and Gender, edited with Elinor Acampo, examines a crossroad in the French experience of modernization, especially in regard to ideas about gender and sexuality. Bodies and Culture, Discourses, Communities, Representation, Performances, edited with Damon Talbot and Marie Jansen, focus on the role of culture in shaping forms and conception of the corporeal. Fat, Cultural History and Materiality is also the title of a Bloomsbury volume co-edited with cultural sociologist Alison Leitch, exploring the complex physical and experiential dimension of this problematic substance. Breaks new ground in the study of relation between culture and the material world. Also from Bloomsbury, honor Violence and Emotions in History, co-edited with Caroline Strange and Robert Cribb, which draws on cross-disciplinary scholarship on the study of emotions to analyze the history of honor and violence across a broad range of cultures and regions from a combined perspective of cultural and social history. And with all this background of brilliant work, we welcome Chris to present our final plenary lecture, Revolts Against the Modern World, Masculinity, Modernity, and the Far-Right Body Politics.
Great. Hi, everyone. Thank you, Alessandra, for that really great introduction. I really do appreciate that. Thank you to all of you for sticking around on the last day of the conference. I'm really thrilled that this is not full, as I think I would get a little freaked out by that. I'd like to thank Filippo and the other conference organizers for inviting me to speak. I mean, I really appreciate it. I do appreciate the work done by I guess, grad students and postdocs maybe, who've been really just kind of helping keep things going. And I really do appreciate that. I've been told I cannot touch this, so we will see how this goes. Apologies in advance, because I've already guaranteed that, I've already not guaranteed anything of ours, but I could cause all kinds of problems. So, let's start with this. This is very much a work in progress. It is, parts of this I've presented elsewhere, but I've not tied them together in quite this way. Other elements of this are really quite new. It's part of the two broader projects that I have going on right now, and you will probably see where some of the themes in those books are being kind of tried out in a paper like this. So yeah, let's get started. Okay. So in early 2022, YouTube began featuring dozens, in fact, it may be hundreds, of 2 to 3 minute inspirational videos entitled Reject Modernity, Embrace Masculinity. Preceded and partly inspired by the less overtly masculinist series of conservative memes entitled Reject Modernity, Embrace Tradition, and there are variations on both of these that you can see online. And these began appearing in 2018. These new memes, newer by 2020, present similar before and after narratives, whereby caricatures of perceived gender disorder, whether they're in the images of physically weak and effeminate males, women in positions of power, transgender people, are contrasted with equally caricatured images of muscular males engaged in bodybuilding, military duty, or some other masculine pursuit. It didn't take long for the trend to be picked up on TikTok and other social media platforms to become a fount of inspiration for some and a target of ridicule for others. As one might expect, those seeking to make sense of this phenomenon frame it in terms of our present woes and from the comfort of their own echo chambers. Here, such manifestations of an implicitly non- or anti-modern toxic masculinity are cited as wrong-headed reactions against modern woke culture with its focus on race and gender. In a discussion of the meme on a popular gaming forum, one user wondered, why does this sound like a fascist slogan? And that's actually a really good question because it kind of does. But I would also point out that it is not exclusively that, and that's something that I think makes the slogan somewhat interesting. These memes intrigue me for a number of reasons. The first is a little self-interested. The oppositions it draws between masculinity and modernity or civilization resonates with my previous work on the topic going back, I'm horrified to realize, of 2 decades. That's not good. Gender scholars have rightly pointed out how modernization processes, which may include capitalism, technological innovations, imperialism, and representative democracies, have often worked to the advantage of white male elites, creating social, political, and economic and symbolic structures that have historically allowed them to subjugate, control, and marginalize women, proletarians, people of other ethnic and racial groups, etc. That modernization processes are intimately bound up with structures of domination seems fairly self-evident. Yet to equate modernity with male control is to assume the relative stability of these features of modern life. as if the complexity of masculine identity as it is lived, and not merely as it is represented, can be reduced to the socioeconomic control that elite males often perpetuate and from which they benefit. Against these assumptions, I argued in these books that the middle class and mostly white lifestyles and habits associated with modern civilization, and my initial point of entry here was the decades around 1900, where sometimes they talk about the moderns. More often they would talk about the civilization, but what they meant was largely, well, not identical, but fairly similar. These lifestyles and habits associated with modern civilization, especially those characterized by polite, cerebral, consumerist, and sedentary practices that threaten to weaken bodies and minds, these have been since at least the 16th century in a state of tension with the physically robust and/or bellicose models of masculinity inherited from the past that continue to haunt men in the present. I maintained that as a corporeal experience, modern civilization, or modernity, exercises a double logic that promotes and supports the interests of males while threatening to undermine those interests by eroding the corporeal foundations of male privilege. Hence, I would make a distinction between men and masculinity, which I think is actually a fairly useful thing to do. From this perspective, the language of masculinity crisis recurs precisely because the material and experiential circumstances that provide the framework through which certain men assert their dominance over women, children, and people of other races are themselves fraught with contradictions that gnaw away at the corporeal basis on which androcentrism, or masculinism, stands. If we agree with Reinhard Koselleck that crisis is a structural signifier of modernity, then I would argue that it makes sense to view so-called crises of masculinity as afforded, at least in part, by this deeper experience of crisis. The reject modernity, embrace masculinity memes also interest me because, wittingly or not, they echo a slogan that resonates across the Euro-American far right, Revolt against the modern world, which is borrowed from the title of Italian radical traditionalist author Julius Evola, who has emerged as one of the most widely cited voices in far-right countercultures. We see this slogan in far-right clothing brands that help to forge group identities, such as Greifvogel and Ansgar Aryan, among others, and militant groups like the active clubs that began in the US but now have come to Europe, and now there's this really transatlantic communication taking place here. It has even made its way into that far-right musical style known as Fashwave, where the prolific electronic composer Julius used it as a title of one of his releases. I have to give you a trigger warning here, at least to music lovers, because this stuff sucks. But here it is. Any music that I can make myself to be listened to. There are no words to any of these tracks. It's just sort of electronic pop. So you're supposed to, I guess, imagine this is the title track. Anyway, yeah. And it doesn't get better. It doesn't build up into something wonderful. No, it doesn't. For Evola, this revolt against modernity is overtly masculinist and spiritually, at least, racist, calling upon Western men to tap into their ancestral links to the far north so as to withstand the impact of a feminizing world. In this presentation, let me just go back a little bit here. Come on, you're not supposed to see that. Which I suppose we might call an exercise in very contemporary history. I would like to unpack this slogan in the context of current discussions of masculinity and the body as they relate to recurring historical complaints about the feminizing effects of modern life. My general hypothesis, which is, at this point is not really an argument, because I think I need more evidence to really make this an argument, is that a shared climate of ambivalence of and distrust about modern life may play a role in facilitating movement across the divide that separates unhappy men in that loose network of online male support groups known as the manosphere, and the far right and the world of far right countercultures. First, I will examine issues of modernity as they relate to the body in general. Second, I will discuss the far right's engagement with modernity. And finally, I will end by exploring two examples of right-wing vitalism, Casa Pound d'Italia and Generation Identity, where what they see as embodied revolts against the modern take place. My focus will be on the practices and experiences of militants rather than voters, and I will bracket out the potential real-world consequences of such ideas in the form of racist and gender-based discrimination and violence, which is, of course, not to say that these things can be ignored. Okay. Well, and also I should mention this, while I realize I'm not dealing with a coherent unity, all right, I'm very, very aware of that. I will, following Jeffrey Kaplan and Leonard Weinberg, and for the sake of simplicity, refer to the Euro-American radical, or more likely I'll be saying Euro-American far right, which has emerged since the 1990s and whose ties have grown stronger in the internet age. Let me emphasize again, I'm not suggesting something coherent and unified. Obviously, what takes place in the US is very, very different in many respects from what takes place on the continent, but they're not that far apart. I should stress that given the richness of this topic, my presentation will necessarily be a bit general and selective. I also tend to, and I always do this, err on the side of conceptualization, and I've been criticized for that, but that's just, I can't stop it, I don't know why. And leaves out details and nuances that could be addressed during the Q&A session that follows. So let's get started. As many of us know, terms like modern and modernity are pretty difficult to define, and I'm not going to rehearse all the ways in which one can do this. In one recent text, theorists of decoloniality suggest that by the 21st century, the concept of modernity was absorbed by and subsumed under neoliberal globalization. Neoliberalism and the Washington Consensus displaced the compromise of development and modernization and replaced it with development and globalization, which displaced the subsumed liberal connotation of progress, modernity, civilization, and development. This point is useful insofar as the targets of much far-right anger are variously identified as globalization, modernity, civilization. So when they talk about modernity, you can also view it as a shorthand for other things. Globalization, bringing along with that immigration. It also entails feminism, gender studies, or just gender, multiculturalism, etc. Okay, so modern for many of these people is a shorthand for other things. And of course, they can also refer to Americanization, the Great Replacement, the Kali Yuga, for those who are more esoterically inclined. Rather than view modernity as a synonym for processes of modernization, as these authors do, I prefer a loosely phenomenological approach that foregrounds the messy world of embodied lived experience, as well as structures of domination. The works of social theorists like Zygmunt Bauman and Anthony Giddens are especially useful here. And I do like their works a lot, as is the work, which I'll talk about more, of literary scholar Marshall Berman, who famously described modernity as a mode of vital experience of space and time, of the self and others, of life's possibilities and perils. And of course, embedded within this has to be this notion of the body as it is lived physically. That is shared by men and women all over the world today. Like Bauman and Giddens, Berman views this experience as intrinsically contradictory. To be modern is to find ourselves in an environment that promises us adventure, power, growth, transformation of ourselves and the world. And at the same time, that threatens to destroy everything we have, everything we know, everything we are. What strikes me as essential in this discussion is Berman's focus on vital experience, which shifts the focus from how the modern world is represented to how it is lived. To be modern, he writes, is to live a life of paradox and contradiction. You might even say that to be fully modern is to be anti-modern. It's been impossible to grasp and embrace the modern world's potentialities without loathing and fighting against some of its most palpable realities. While this seems fair enough, it also begs the question, is there a form of human life that is actually free of paradox and contradiction? Arguably, embodiment itself commits all of us to living irresolvable tensions between experience the body as a foundation of agency, source of pleasure, vehicle of expression, and guarantor of meaning, if not feelings of transcendence, and the vexing facts of our own materiality, animality, vulnerability, and mortality that rudely return us to our earthbound selves. Social psychology, particularly among those group of scholars who practice what they call terror management theory, demonstrates that fantasies about control, invulnerability, and even immortality are really more properly viewed as human rather than exclusively masculine or male dreams, even though you may, and I do tend to see more of a fixation on these themes in male writing for whatever reason. As a mode of vital experience, then, the paradoxes of modernity engage directly with pre-existing and arguably universal contradictions about human embodiment. I mention these things to emphasize the overlap between far-right and more mainstream perspectives when it comes to the physical and emotional challenges posed by modern lifestyles, and modern institutions, et cetera, and to speculate on how radicalization is partly made possible through these shared experiences. There is, after all, a tendency in reporting on far-right culture to dwell on its purported irrationality and reliance on emotion more than reason, as well as its general intolerance for ambiguity, which are true, but not necessarily unique to the far right. Thus, one sees references to the fantasy and magical thinking related to something like fascism and populism, as if the far right has a monopoly on such non-rational perspectives. When it comes to thinking about modernity and the body, the situation, I think, is more complex. After all, it has historically been middle-class whites, specifically middle-class white men, who have been the most vociferous critics of the modernity they mostly created and from which they usually benefit in socioeconomic and political terms. Hence obsessions that we have with the natural and the organic, with the great outdoors, etc. Now, some have rejected proposals to reject modernity in favor of simpler and more natural ways of living as the privileged fantasy of educated white elites, and there are, of course, elements of truth to that. Yet in their broadest sense, slogans like reject modernity may resonate with people for a variety of reasons, not least due to the oft-cited mental and physical problems that accompany the experience of being modern. Cancer, depression, diabetes, obesity, acne, cardiovascular problems are just some of the conditions that have been termed variously over the years diseases of civilization, diseases of affluence, or simply diseases of modernity. Among the other things we can add to this list is loneliness, or a crisis of connection, which the US Surgeon General just last year declared an epidemic in the country, and which numerous studies show correlates with right-wing political positions, which I think is an interesting dimension to how we try to make sense of who votes for Trump, for example, or the AfD or whatever. It is perhaps no wonder that so many diet and wellness regimens, as well as foodie culture and even holiday planning, often encourage modern people to seek solutions to modernity outside of modernity, or at least to avail themselves of modern goods, services, and practices that promise temporary retreats from the modern. I find that one never actually moves out of the modern because modernity has things to sell you to take care of the problems of the modern. For instance, texts on diet and dieting are often steeped in nostalgia for lost pre- or non-modern worlds, as if the present day represents a sort of fall from some original plenitude of health, beauty, and morality. Dietetic references to these lost worlds, and this book is really an interesting study of exactly that, often provide models for future living and have been imagined in a number of ways. For instance, as the prehistoric cave, that's kind of like the paleo diet. The Garden of Eden, that would be the Eden diet that evangelical Christians are promoting. The pre-colonial diet, or references to diets from the pre-industrial world. Hence the attractions of the paleo diet, the Mediterranean diet, the locavore movement, and the slow food movement, and among others, that for all their health benefits, evoke fantasies of the pre- or non-modern or non-Western or as correctives of the present. Just referring to the Mediterranean diet, I mean, it's been pointed out that the antecedents of that, the originators of that, are rarely, just identified as North African. It's almost always ancient Greece and Rome, and I think that is very telling, the kind of fantasy that partly takes place there. Again, which isn't to say that it's not a good diet. I'm just saying these diets are not free of fantasies about the past, fantasies about the future. Others seek release from the physical and affective constraints and tedium of modernity by engaging in physically intense and or risky activities that promise euphoria and even feelings of transcendence. The quest for intense experiences emerged most visibly on both sides of the Atlantic in the decades before historical fascism unfolded in the 1920s and persists to the present, arguably accelerating in recent years. The geographer Nigel Thrift describes the proliferation in recent decades of sometimes intense, what he calls immersive practices that in our go faster world, he says, entail a heightened awareness of movement, an expansion of awareness of the present. Thrift even proposes that immersive practices may be contributing to what he calls a new form of vitalism, a stance to feeling life in the doubled sense of both a grasp of life and emotional attunement to it, which explain many of the strong, sometimes even fanatical, investments that are placed on the natural. There are therefore reasons why many engage in voluntary risk-taking that some sociologists, following the work of Stephen Ling, have dubbed edge work. Insofar as edge work experiences confirm participants as part of an elite body, shared experiences but build social bonds and affords distinctions between the inner circle of participants and outsiders. Ling describes this as a paradox of modern life. The same society that offers so much in the way of material quality of life also propels many of us to the limits of our mortal existence in search of ourselves and our humanity. In addition, we might add the explosion of new forms of spirituality since the 1960s, although the roots of this definitely go back to the late 19th century, the rise of theosophy, the explosion of interest in yoga, which has obviously come back again in the past few decades, big time. In addition, we might add the explosion of new forms of spirituality, many of which eschew the label religion altogether. Many of them refer to themselves as, just like a lot of people today say, oh, I'm not religious, but I'm spiritual, which is a very common gesture. This is surely one example of seeking out experiences and meaning that modernity can only rarely provide. It is telling that, for example, in her book Strange Rights, Tamara Burton describes both the woke left and the far right as being more or less religious in terms of what they offer to their adherents. A sense of meaning, a sense of belonging, locating oneself within a larger story, things like that. And also, of course, the sense of community and that. Finally, annual events like the Burning Man Festival arguably attest, I did not take this video, I wasn't there, arguably attest to modern people's lingering hunger for ritual and meaning in a largely secular and materialist modern world. I mentioned these examples, and one could go into depth, if one liked, simply to propose that rather than an exclusively far-right practice, revolts against the modern world are in fact integral features of living in the modern world. This is less to draw some kind of equivalence, of course, between far-right and mainstream positions than to point to some deeper connections that may render migration from one domain to the other more comprehensible. Berman's apt sentence might thus be rephrased: to be fully modern is to revolt against modernity, at least from time to time, without ever being able to fully succeed. I was considering at one point talking more about how this worked out in the historical fascisms, because a crises of civilization are all over those discourses, but there's simply no time here. This is one reason why, although I tell my students that a lot of what I see today seems like a reiteration in much more, obviously, recent, postmodern, if you like, terms, of concerns that animated a lot of people during the 1890s or so. Okay, so I see continuities where others tend to see abrupt ruptures. I see it as more complex than that. Now, let's talk about the far right and its engagements with modernity. We tend to assume that the far right is a zone of pure negativity, characterized by hate that needs to be combated by its opposite, which could be hope. This binary is baked into the very name of the British advocacy group Hope Not Hate, which is, by the way, not to detract from the good work the organization does. To be sure, on the far right, there's certainly a lot of hate to be found, and violence as well. But is focusing on these disturbing features the most accurate way to approach far-right politics, at least in terms of what it is that attracts people to it? as militants. Okay, again, I need to specify what I'm talking about here. Let's take the idea of fascism, which is often used today rather loosely as a synonym for all manner of authoritarianisms. Would this worldview really remain attractive if its message was solely negative? Fascism should not be reduced to its negativity, argues historian Rasmus Fleischer. It does not have an evil core made of pure hatred, quite the contrary. Fascism is, in the words of Roger Griffin, a totalizing vision of national or ethnic rebirth, aiming at a new era of cultural homogeneity and health. That's the hope side of the far right, so within the hate is hope, I suppose. Here, Fleischer gestures towards a new consensus in the scholarly study of fascism, encouraged mainly by the contributions of the British historian Roger Griffin. Historically experienced by many as uprooting, disorienting, unhealthy, and even degenerate, Griffin argues, modernity is a process by which ontological certainties, that's basically existential certainties, came to be undermined. The disruption of such certainties contributed to what he calls the perceived existentially real crisis of history experienced as acute, even unbearable anomie that led some to promote radical projects for national rebirth or regeneration. For scholars like Griffin, fascism is largely about national regeneration, or in fact, a kind of rebirth in a very real sense. When viewed in this way, fascism promotes a radical transformation of the human being, what the historian Emilio Gentile calls an anthropological revolution, that is, a revolution in the very meaning of the anthropos, of the human, that allows it to function as a political religion, promising to restore ontological security through a purified version of the modern. So not anti-modern, but in fact an attempt to redo the modern with heavy doses from very often an imagined past. The common notion that fascism is irredeemably anti-modern, thus a deviation from the Western mainstream, is therefore problematic. As the anthropologist Maddalena Camelli emphasizes, fascism is not monstrous, inhuman, or alien in any way. And these are statements that I understand when you read them, and I have the same reaction. It's like, what? It's bad stuff, right? For us, I assume, but for others, obviously, a very different thing, is a phenomenon wholly entangled with modernity in the way we use reason to justify multiple forms of supremacy. Some recent studies of fascism and gender have started to move into this domain of looking at what they sometimes call positive affect. What are the feelings of peace, of happiness that are being promoted, advertised, largely through images not of cities, but of the natural world, of the great outdoors. Again, these anti-modern locations. As a fellow traveler of historical fascists, the Italian traditionalist author Julius Evola is among the most widely cited philosophical sources for the Euro-American far right. And as mentioned, the title of his 1934 book is used as a slogan across, in many examples of far right propaganda. In general, Evola laments the decline of a world, he says, was once dominated by white warrior peoples who migrated from the far north only to find themselves corrupted by the darker-skinned feminine peoples of the south, whose ascent to dominance, he says, is a key marker of the modern world against which he promotes revolt. Evola's vision for the future thus entails remasculinization and regeneration of a white world extending, as some noted, across the entirety of Eurasia, not least through the rediscovery of what he calls tradition. If anybody here is familiar with the Russian philosopher, fascist philosopher, although he doesn't like the name, Alexander Dugin, he is somebody heavily inspired by Evola, by this notion of tradition, by ideas about Hyperborea, the mythical white homeland during the primordial period. Evola's spiritual, sometimes espousing what we might call esoteric fascist themes, Evola's spiritual bent lends itself readily to addressing, or perhaps informing, some of the clearly existential or ontological yearnings identified across the far right, especially among young people. These yearnings are expressed in a number of forms that have no necessary link to the far right, from the proliferation of life coaching and a fascination with Stoicism to adherence to the somewhat banal teachings of Jordan Peterson, for whom the Evolian concept of tradition actually remains a powerful attractor, even though he insists that he is not a fascist, and I don't think that he was. I don't know exactly he's kind of gotten a little loopy in recent years, so I don't know where exactly he stands. Nevertheless, as the aging Evola Evolah's hopes for renewal faded, that is, societal, cultural renewal, he encouraged the worthy few to, as he said, to ride the tiger of modernity while striving to remain unaffected by it, at least until the new world dawned. For such a person Evola describes as the differentiated man, the man who finds himself involved in today's world, even at its most problematic and paroxysmal points, and he does not belong inwardly to such a world, nor will he give in to it. He feels himself, in essence, as belonging to a different race from that of the overwhelming majority of his contemporaries. The thing about Evola is that when he talks about race, it's usually meant to be spiritual, which of course is never thoroughly spiritual. So there always does tend to be something, bodily that goes along with it. By keeping the habits, institutions, and customs of the bourgeois world at arm's length, the differentiated man effects and sustains a revolt against the modern world, first and foremost within himself, which implies a reorientation of what Bourdieu might call the habitus, in such a way as to withstand the worst aspects of modernity until some undisclosed future time. Until then, Evola says, the differentiated man must remain apolitical. Although Evola maintains that the differentiation of the sexes is authentic and absolute only in the spirit, this spirit is necessarily bound up with the body and the senses. For Evola, the renewal of the white European needs to be profoundly felt rather than merely thought. As he noted in his book, Pagan Imperialism, we must reawaken to a renewed, spiritualized, and austere sense of the world, not as a philosophic concept, but as something which vibrates in our very blood, to the sensation of the world as power, the sensation of the world as rhythm, the sensation of the world as a sacrificial act. This is why I view Evola's much-cited revolt against the modern world as implicitly a matter of embodiment and affect as well as spirit. Far-right militants obviously do not share the older Evola's apolitical recommendations, and frankly, it would be a stretch to suggest that most of them have really read all of or really understood much of his work. I mean, again, I'm not suggesting that militants, when they're confused about something, turn to Evola for some kind of advice. It doesn't really work out that way. But they eagerly appropriate his call to revolt against the modern world as a means of promoting white male regeneration. For the contemporary far right, the revolt against modernity addresses a wider range of concerns than those identified by Evola. What comes across as a preoccupation with violence and death in right-wing politics sometimes conceals the explicit alignment of rightist groups with what they call life, if not lifestyle. These may take the form of inward-looking practices like fight training and mixed martial arts competitions, but also participation in alternative music scenes, fashion choices, and other forms of community building, including direct militant action itself. Especially vivid examples of far-right vitalism, which may be found in the media and practices linked to Casa Pound Italia. Since its emergence in 2003, this neo-fascist group was a major inspiration for other European militants and has been described as the backbone of the recently victorious Brothers of Italy party. According to Maddalena Camelli, belonging to Casa Pound is not a question of political program or formal decisions, but rather a phenomenon centered on lived experience. It is a lifestyle best represented by violence and the ability to face death. Conversations with militants support this claim. The next few quotes I have here are quotes from her ethnography, from her informants. No one becomes a fascist because he read the Manifesto of Verona of 1943, or of any other political document, explains one militant. Beyond any specific ideological statement, the militant lifestyle offers a feeling of the world that appeals to something pre-rational that is rationalized later. What draws one to fascism, then, is a magical attraction to a certain manner of living his life. Vitalism cultivated through vigorous and painful practices is essential to the experience of belonging to Casa Pound. Political scientists Pietro Gattinari and Caterino Froio note that some of Casa Pound's actions share a vitalistic understanding of physical pain that is not, however, nihilist or self-destructive. Rather, it represents a collective, vital reaction against a dominant cultural model that has reduced the human body to a commodity. This, I think, I find this an interesting point because so often I'm referring here to some other work I'm doing. Far-right fight clubs are seen as a kind of quest for pain, something masochistic and all of that. And I'm not saying that that is not maybe part of it, but that does neglect all of the other dimensions of the martial arts that do tend to be understood as spiritual, as meaning providing, okay? And I would not want to separate that out from this analysis, regardless of how the nasty ends towards which this violence is promoting. Insofar as such vitalism is located within the group, it may constitute an aggressive reaction against the pressures and expectations of modernity, a fight against what some would call the violences of everyday life. What is the youth seeking in Casa Pound? Casa Pound leader Gianluca Ionone once wondered. They're looking for life. Casa Pound is life in a world of the dead. This theme of we are alive and everyone else is dead is a recurring theme, particularly in Casa Pound, but you do see it elsewhere. Take, for example, Ionone's rock band Zeta Zero Alpha, whose apparently they were well known enough to make the cover of Rolling Stone some years ago, whose concerts offer opportunities for especially vigorous forms of male bonding. When the band launches into one of its signature songs, Chinquilla Matanza, which is loosely translated, I guess, as Massacre Belt. I've never seen a single translation of this. It may not be translated. Young men in the mosh pit in front of the stage begin whipping each other with belts often until they draw blood. Simone Di Stefano, according to the right-wing politician Stefano Di Stefano, the practice is a way to risk pain, to confront yourself in a way society does not allow. One of the things that people like Di Stefano might be talking about are things that have actually changed in the wider culture, such as unsupervised play, what will be the word? Voluntary rough play, where individuals engage with each other basically in fights, but without anger. These are things that have actually kind of receded in many Western cultures, particularly the US, but I get a sense that this has been underway elsewhere. This search for what they call life is also evident in generation identity, a now proscribed pan-European far-right youth movement heavily influenced by Casa Pound. Founded in 2012, Generation Identity was created as the youth branch of the French New Right political association Bloc Identitaire, created in 2002 before changing its name to Les Identitaires. In his quasi-manifesto of the Generation Identity movement, the Austrian militant Markus Willinger claimed to launch a declaration of war against the generation of 1968. Feminization is one of Willinger's chief complaints about the post-68 world. As we search for our identity, we want to become hard again. There are many, many other quotes I could have pulled out of here. We don't want to be soft and posh anymore. We want to be strong and happy. We want to experience the world through sweat and ravenous gulps of fresh air, not to have it presented to us on the sofa. This critique of consumerism runs throughout this book. In fact, the issues of immigration, which you might have thought with a text like Generation Identity, dealing with generation identity would come in the beginning. It comes much later in the volume after they create this critique of modernity and then basically show what it leads to. Appealing to the experiential is one way that other militants like Martin Sellner, fellow Austrian, try to recruit young militants. And Sellner gives an example of an intense experience that one can't really read about to understand. If you've never been part of a political action, you'll not understand the feeling. Imagine a difficult final exam. Combine that with the first attempt at flirting in your life. Multiply it by 10, and then no. The night before an action or a big demo just can't be put into words. You have to live and suffer through it yourself. The resemblance to the kinds of experiences sought out by football hooligans who, almost all the research on these groups suggests, by their own reckoning is that what they're seeking is what they call the buzz, or some other variation of that, but buzz is that term that keeps cropping up. The resemblance is really quite striking, and it would have been really useful to include them in this analysis, but there's really no time to do this. But this is kind of an interesting book dealing with ultras in Italy. And as you can see there just by the subtitle, this is explicitly, this is an ethnography that this guy did. He's also quite partisan as well, so you have to be a little careful with this text. But nevertheless, the information he provides is really quite interesting. Identitarian websites and magazines, many of which are now defunct, reflect similar concerns. Part of what makes the identitarian counterculture appealing, I guess was, I should say, although it exists in other forms today, is its promise of the intense authenticity of lived experience that may take the form of vigorous and even aggressive physical action. In the now defunct Projet Apache website, this is basically a bloc identitaire offshoot that was a precursor to Generation Identity itself. And on this website, one militant approvingly affirmed that this other youth has opted for something more than consumerism and despair. He writes that there exists a Parisian youth which refuses to merely survive, a Parisian youth that wants to live, both feet on the ground, their heads in the clouds. The Projet Apache Manifesto invited those who also refused to be a pawn stuck forever between wage slavery, television stupidity, and virtual escapism to join the project. These are actually common themes in identitarian writings. In fact, it's not even exclusively men, although it's largely males. It's not entirely. A speech by a female militant affirmed the identitarian fascination with a new vitalism. We are the other youth, she writes, because we have decided to live. But what does living mean in this context? Physical action, fighting in particular, is cited as a central aspect of the life chosen by young identitarians. Life is a fight is a common identitarian slogan, which seems to have been borrowed from the Stoic philosopher Seneca, and Stoicism, as you probably know, has become much bigger in the past decade or so. Heroism, faith, and transcendence of the self are also central ideals of the ultra jeunesse group. This was evident years before Generation Identity was founded in a 2007 issue of IDE magazine devoted to the question of far-right militancy. Recognizing that in the present day, the modern militant is primarily virtual, this author reminded readers of the sensual dimension that's been lost in the digital realm. To militate is, above all, he says, to take a physical risk. Quite often you see in these texts, and not just in Europe, an aversion to what they call keyboard warriorism, okay? The idea that if you're going to be a militant, you have to literally have skin in the game, as they say, okay? And that, of course, does make sense given the other ideas here. Identitarian leader, there are other articles here that it would be worth talking about, but I didn't want to keep you here for an hour. The identitarian leader and bass player for the rock band Fraction Hexagon. He's also was leader of IDF, the Ile-de-France. Fabrice Robert concurred, praising the great thirst for the ideal, action and transcendence of the self that was manifest in the pursuit of courage, the feeling for sacrifice, honor, fidelity, attachment to one's clan, and solidarity over repression. Quoting his own earlier identitarian rock band, IDF, Robert described the path of the militant as a process of killing the bourgeois within himself, which I think is a really interesting metaphor that gets cited quite a lot. One way of killing the bourgeois within was to undergo rigorous training. It's kind of weird. There's this blank slide. Oh. How weird. Yeah. I was going through here, like trying to find the blank slide. Where's the blank slide? And it wasn't there. Wow. Okay. Oh, that's why there must be sorry, you're not supposed to be hearing all this. It's supposed to be going on quietly in here. Okay. One way of killing the the bourgeois within was to undergo rigorous training. From the formation of Les Identitaires in 2003 up into Generation Identity's formal dissolution in 2021, identitarian militants could receive formal training in annual week-long summer camps, which are sometimes promoted as revolts against the modern world. When the sociologist Samuel Boron went undercover in an identitarian summer camp, he found an emphasis on sociability and intense experience that seemed more important than explicit political ideas. What makes such camps effective, he writes, is their ability to capture an individual by speaking to his body, to his unconscious, to the whole ensemble of incorporated things. Camps, he writes, are thus able to mobilize dispositions and schemes of thought of action, of which the person may not be even conscious. Evoking the work of Pierre Bourdieu, Boron maintains that a militant habitus is crafted not solely or even primarily from ideological indoctrination, but from embodied experience itself. This is a common theme in many studies of radicalization. People are not drawn into it by the politics at first. The ideology comes later. It is the other things that people are seeking out, that they're looking for. Not unlike the widely promoted revolt against the modern world, the identitarian cult of virility, as some scholars call it, is meant to be intensely lived. By drawing out some of his sexed dispositions, a male camper may be worked on and exploited. He may also make himself available to female identitarians seeking a real man as a romantic partner. This is why Boron maintains that along with others studying radicalization, that it is an illusion to believe that one can somehow cure militants of their ideology by preaching to them Republican and humanist values. Insisting that we deconstruct the link we systematically make between physical violence and far-right ideology, Boron calls into question the common belief that militants are made by ideology alone. Go back a bit. Much has been left out of this talk, which is very much, like I said, a work in progress. I've not addressed the use of violence against immigrants and the misogynistic stances of the far right generally, all of which are obviously as important as they are disturbing. Nor have I addressed what the far right says about the superior virility of immigrants when compared to what are described as the weakened white European men who, again, I'm just using their language, have no strength or courage. Nor am I going to talk about how they note the shared contempt for modernity that one sees among Islamist groups and among many far-right groups. Many others have addressed these issues, though it's interesting to note how often these practices are described in far-right texts as symptoms rather than causes of the current crisis. This is why Paul Wagner, best known as the man behind the American folkish groups Operation Werewolf and the Wolves of Vinland, issued a telegram post declaring that rejecting modernity is more than a slogan to sound interesting. It is a rejection of all the trappings of that modern world that are damaging, deracinating, and disintegrating to who we are as human beings, who we are as people. The rejection Wagner promotes is physical as well as spiritual. And while he usually censors himself in his online posts, the white supremacism and anti-feminism of Operation Werewolf are apparent to many. It is, after all, at the heart of Evolah's call for revolt as well, and Evolah cited frequently by Wagner. Though, as I have proposed, revolts against the modern world may be essential to trying to survive in that world. This is why, unlike some journalists, I prefer to take seriously the self-help dimension of our so-called crisis of masculinity as being evidence of a deeper malaise that will probably not be resolved through common methods. After all, as Christine Emba and Richard Reeves aptly point out, whereas the progressive left really doesn't have a lot to offer men, the far right is enthusiastically engaged in their recruitment by directly appealing to concerns about meaning, belonging, and questions about how to live. If, as many specialists affirm, people often become radicalized less by ideology than by feelings of belonging and community, and adventure in meaningful intensity, which is in short supply in the modern world, then it seems to me that maybe this other dimension, this aspect of the lived, might be also inquiring into, alongside all of the other work that's done on discourse, on structures of domination, and things like that. Thank you very much.